Practice and assessment are not the same thing, but a lot of us, myself included, early in my career, accidentally treated them that way. Today, I want to talk about what the practice phase is actually for and why getting this right might be one of the biggest workload reducers you can make as a multiple prep teacher.
Welcome to the Secondary Teacher Podcast, the podcast for middle and high school teachers juggling multiple preps to get the strategies to reduce overwhelm so that you don't have to choose between being an effective teacher and prioritizing important relationships. I'm your host, Khristen Massic, a 10-year high school engineering teacher, former middle school assistant principal, and teacher coach. Every week, we will discuss strategies, systems, and time-saving tips to help you not only survive but thrive as a multiple prep teacher.
We're in the third episode of this series on the Introduce, Practice, Produce framework. 2 episodes ago, in episode 350, we talked about why every lesson has a job. Last time, we went deep into the introduction lessons, specifically the difference between a hook that entertains and an introduction that actually prepares students for what comes next. Today, practice, and specifically why this is the phase most of us rush through without realizing it. When I first started teaching, I graded everything, every activity, every assignment, everything students did in my classroom, it went in the gradebook. Not because I was trying to be punitive, not because I thought students needed constant evaluation, but because I genuinely thought that's what teaching required. Students do work, work gets a grade, grades go in the book. That was my mental model. And so what I was essentially doing was moving students from introduction straight to performance over and over again. They'd encounter something new, complete an assignment, I'd grade it, and then we'd move on. There wasn't really a practice phase, not intentionally anyway. And I can tell you what that cost me. An enormous amount of grading, and students who were still confused. Those grades reflected where they were at the beginning of learning something, not where they ended up. It wasn't until I started reading about standards-based grading philosophy, and specifically an article by Guskey and Jung that I came across in ASCD, that something shifted for me. The argument was simple, but it stopped me cold. If a grade is supposed to represent what a student knows at the end of a course, then why are we letting what they didn't know at the beginning pull that grade down? A student who struggles in week 2 but masters the concept by week 8, what does their grade actually show? The learning process, not the learning outcome. And those are 2 completely different things. I'll be honest, I'm going to go much deeper on grading philosophy later this year. I have a whole series planned about grading shifts for multiple prep teachers, and I think it's going to be one of the most useful things I've done on this podcast. But for today, that shift in thinking changed one specific thing about how I plan. Practice stopped being something I collected and graded. It became something students did while they still had time to learn from it. And that one change made everything lighter. So let me reframe what the practice phase is actually supposed to do. It's not another assignment. It's not a stepping stone for the grade. The purpose of practice is feedback. Feedback for students so that they know what they understand and what they don't, while there's still time to do something about it. And feedback for you so that you know what still needs to be taught before you assess anything. Practice is where misconceptions surface, where questions come, where students discover the gap between what they thought they understood and what they actually understood. And that's enormously valuable information, but only if it happens before the grade. Let me bring this back to the unit I'm planning live inside the unit planning lab. Last week, I talked about how I designed the introduction for the 3D printing unit, not to explain slicer settings, but to create a reason for students to care about them. Now comes the practice phase, and here's what I don't want. Students hear an explanation, print one object, turn it in, wait for me to tell them what they did wrong. That's not practice. That's delayed feedback. Instead, I want students making decisions while they still have time to adjust those decisions. Maybe they're changing slicer settings and comparing results, talking with the partner about why one print turned out differently than another, testing an idea, noticing what happened, making another adjustment. The specific activity matters less than this. Students are getting information they can immediately use because learning happens while students are still allowed to make mistakes, not after I've entered a grade. As I've gotten more intentional about this phase, here are 3 things to look for. 1, Students receive feedback while they're still working, not after, during, because that's when they actually use it. Feedback that arrives at 3 days after an assignment is submitted is information. It's not really feedback anymore, because the moment for learning from it has passed. 2, students have an opportunity to revise. Practice isn't proving what they already know, it's improving what you don't know yet. If students never get a chance to change their thinking, to try again, to adjust, to apply what they just learned, they're not really practicing. They're performing. And performance before understanding is one of the fastest ways to end up with grades that don't reflect what students actually know. 3, practice doesn't automatically require a grade. I know this one can feel uncomfortable, especially if you're used to putting everything in the gradebook. But here's the reframe. If students are still learning, I actually want mistakes. Mistakes tell me what still needs to be taught. They're information, not failure. And if I'm grading every mistake along the way, I'm measuring the learning process instead of the learning outcome. That's the shift. And honestly, removing grades from practice activities was one of the single biggest reductions in my grading workload. Not because I was doing less, but because I stopped collecting things that were never meant to be collected. If you're managing multiple preps, this matters even more than it might seem, because every assignment you collect is another decision, another rubric, another stack to get through, another grade to enter. And when you're doing that across 3, 4, 5 different courses, the volume becomes the problem, not the grading itself. So instead of asking, what else can I grade? Start asking, what will actually help students learn right now? Those are very different questions, and they usually lead to less grading and better learning at the same time. That's not a coincidence. It's what happens when practice does its actual job. Here's one question worth writing at the top of your lesson plan before you finalize the practice phase of any unit. Where does the feedback happen? Not where does the grade happen? Where does the feedback happen? If you can answer that clearly, you're probably designing a much stronger practice phase than most. Next episode wraps up this series with the produce phase, and I think this might be the most surprising reframe of all 4 episodes, because assessments aren't just about measuring what students learned. They're also one of the most important planning tools you have for the next time you teach this unit. I'll show you what I mean. If you're following along with this series, grab the free secondary teacher planning calendar in the show notes. It's designed to help you map out the full arc of a unit before you start building individual lessons, so you can see where introduction ends, where practice lives, and where students are heading, all at a glance. And if you've been thinking, I wish someone would sit down with me and help me think through my actual unit, that's actually what we do inside the Unit Plan Lab. The next round opens in August. Join the waitlist in the show notes now for early access and first details when registration opens. Before you go, one question. If students didn't receive a grade today, would they still receive useful feedback? Because that's where learning actually grows. Finish something that makes tomorrow lighter. I'll see you next time.